professor of social psychology at the GREPS at the University of Lyon 2. And so we will hear her presentation for 1 hour before a coffee break. And just a reminder for the person who did not sign the form, we are waiting for your form before leaving. And who has the form over there? Thank you. And Sabine, we give you the floor.
Yeah. So, just want to have one. So, good morning. Is it okay? Can you hear me? No? Okay. So I will first start with an illustration because we are all a bit tired and from yesterday evening, and so maybe it's easier to start with something very concrete. It's a little story from the time I was a PhD student. And I was getting data for my PhD study, and I felt a bit surprised when I started to analyze my data. At a theoretical level, I knew that focus group data are not of the same nature than interview data, but and that they therefore may produce different kind of results. However, when I faced some contradictory results, I first was surprised. Let me explain. My PhD study was about social representation of the ecological crisis and climate change in France and Germany. It was a comparative study. And I had conducted 10 focus groups with French in France and with German in Germany. And some of the participants had also previously participated in individual interviews. So sometimes I had the same person doing individual interviews and later a focus group. During the individual interviews, French and German both admitted that they did not know a lot about climate change. When I asked them about causes and consequences, they say to me, "Oh, I'm not so sure, it's a bit difficult. Let me try to explain. I hope I won't make a mistake," and so on. So they were not sure how to correctly explain causes and consequences of climate change. But during focus groups, among other tasks, I asked participants to comment on a word map showing the countries producing the more greenhouse gas and the evolution of this production since 1990. And I invited the groups to discuss this map by just asking, what do you think about that? And then later about causes and consequences of climate change, etc. And in France, participants again admit their lack of knowledge during focus group discussion, and the theme was even the subject of jokes, like, for example, in this focus group, participants saying, okay, there are other greenhouse gases, but CO2 is nearly 80%. Sabine, what are the other gases? Sabine does not say anything. She does not help us. They are laughing. She leaves us ignorant. And she mocks us. I wanted to revise before she arrived, but I had no time. So you see, they make some jokes about ignoring what are causes and consequences. So a result which is quite coherent with the individual interviews. However, in Germany, while during individual interviews participants recognize their lack of knowledge, this ignorance was not a theme discussed during focus groups. And on the contrary, participants even comment on the map in a way that allowed them to claim to be experts. For example, they said to criticize the material. So Brasilia should probably appear here on the map, because their greenhouse gas production is not very far away from France or Great Britain. Yes, that's possible. I don't know why they are missing right now in regard to their greenhouse gas production. They are not very lower. So also, actually, there should be an indication for South America and Africa, even if they are not on the top 10, in order to have a reference, etc., etc. So you see that German people started this task, commenting the map in a very different way, and so that they can appear as expert of this social question. And this contradicts the findings from individual interviews. But the question, as a young PhD student, I was asking myself, okay, what should I consider to be right then? You know, are they expert? Are they not? And one way to interpret this data is probably to say that we have something like a group bias. You will find this in the literature, you know. So that in Germany, participants just do not want to appear ignorant in a group, and so they do as if they know. And in individual interviews, when they are talking to a French interviewee, it's okay to say they don't know. At the same time, of course, a group bias is difficult. It's difficult to interpret this in this way because for French participants, we do not find the same effects. There is coherent results between individual interviews and focus group interviews. They accept to be ignorant even in the group situation. So it's not a group, it might not be a group bias, but something else. And finally, this discrepancy between individual interviews and focus group inform us, we can consider, about a social norm. You know, in France, it's okay not to know how to talk about climate change. In Germany, certainly not. You can say with a French interviewee, I don't know, but with other German people, you cannot say, I don't know about climate change. So what I want to say with this little illustration, because it took me some time, you know, to consider these results and to really interpret these results, to give them meaning, is that in order to interpret focus groups data, you have to really reflect about the epistemological stance you have in the study and why you are doing this study and why you use focus groups. And this brings me, before I will explain the title of my presentation, to different ways of doing social psychology. Starting from this little story is a way to talk a little bit about epistemology and what we are doing in social psychology, because of course there are different ways of doing social psychology. There is a kind of social psychology which I would call social cognition, whose aim is to discover universal processes in an hypothetical deductive approach, like the one in the natural sciences, and human behavior is considered to be caused by stable predisposition, and the individual and the collective are two distinct entities. And therefore, in this kind of approach, of course, if you have a group situation and people do not answer in the same way as individual interviews, it's interpreted like a group bias. But if you move to a more social psychology, and we will see that there are different ways to do that, then you consider that the individual and the collective are two interdependent entities, that historical, cultural, and institutional factors are integral parts of psychology. The object of this social psychology is the conflict between the individual and the collective. And of course, social psychology was a proposal for conducting this more social psychology to renew with this focus on the interaction between the individual and the collective. And I will not talk about that, but it helps us to go beyond some dichotomies between the individual and the collective and to have a more dialectical and therefore dialogical approach. So this is why I would like to name my presentation today The Potentials of Focus Groups for a Social Representation Approach, How to Design Focus Groups and Why. I talk about potential because sometimes you will read that focus groups are a good method for studying social representations, and I agree, they are. However, the question is how you design focus groups, how you use them, and why you use them to offer, so that they can offer their full potential. And of course, this brings me to this presentation. In the first part, I would like to say a little bit about the epistemological stance. I will describe social psychology and how we can use and how social representation theory can be used for this more social psychology. I will then define what focus groups are and what they are not, and how you can use them. And then I will try to give two different focus group studies as examples where we conducted very different focus groups in order to show you how you can design focus groups in different ways depending on the research aim you have and on the context in which you use them. And then I will try to conclude. So it's a huge program for this morning, for 1 hour. Let me start with social psychology, what it is, and so with which epistemological stance I've conducted all these studies. Social psychology is the label given to a much-needed development within social psychology, wrote Himmelweit in 1990. It emphasizes the all-embracing force of the social, institutional, and cultural environments, and with it the study of social phenomena in their own right as they affect and are affected by the members of a particular society. So social psychology therefore recognizes first that cognitive and motivational processes are based on socially shared meanings, and we could also add that emotions, for example, are based on social shared meanings. And on the other hand, it recognizes that many psychological processes are not universal and must be contextualized socially, institutionally, and historically. So it recognizes that individuals are embedded in a context and that their behavior must be analyzed with this in mind, and more broadly, that social phenomena affect and are affected by the members of a particular society. So the culture is not something outside the individual, it's something which is also inside, I have to say, both at the same time, and of course, individual contribute to constitute the culture, the collective, as much as the collective constitute the individual. Social psychology is one way to name this more social approach in social psychology, but there were other propositions like critical psychology, etc. But at least two theoretical approaches really allows us to have this more social approach. It's social representation theory and social identity theory. This was already outlined by Himmelweit and Gaskell in 1990, but of course I use social representation theory because I'm more interested in the knowledge and meanings rather than an identity processes, but we can discuss this later also. So social representation theory in some way appears as a modern synthesis of the first antithesis set far, and we have to say that not all social representation studies adhere or allow for this social psychology, for a more social approach of social reps. It only fits in some conditions. Why? Lopez and Gaskell, in a chapter in 2050, said that the work carried in social representation theory in the last decades had neglected, in some way, the social dimension. What they understand about the social dimension is the interaction between the individual and the collective. A lot of social representation work has been conducted more by focusing on distributed forms of knowledge, on processes like objectification and occurring, rather than their relationship with different social groups and how they are mutually constituted. So what Lopez and Gaskell said is that we should invite social representation theory to go beyond this micro level, how how knowledge is distributed, how individuals familiarize with a new object, etc. And we should try to understand how the macro level interact with what happens on the micro level. And therefore, they propose to have 4 related focuses in the analysis of social phenomena. The first one is to focus on what happens on a macro level. So this involves analyzing the social context that motivates the research questions and analyzing it in all its heterogeneity with all the tensions which might structure the object. They also invite to have a look at the micro level, and at this level, of course, this is what we best know how to do. We should understand how the public makes sense of all these challenges posed by the macro level, by new objects, how we familiarize with that. But they also said that we should develop a focus on what they call contextual mechanism. So indeed, social contexts are sometimes stable and sometimes they are subject to change and transformation caused by new objects, by new traits. And these periods of change are times when things which are taken for granted are called into questions, and we should therefore try to understand how social representations are then reconstructed. And they also invite us to look at more transformational mechanisms. So this involves examining how micro-level outputs will affect the social context. So what happens once we have familiarized with a new object? How may it change the macro level? So this is a kind of contextual framework they provided to understand how the social context gives rise to micro-level phenomena, and for considering how this phenomena subsequently contribute to change at the macro level. But in order to avoid falling into a kind of psychological or sociological reductionism, where the macro level influences the micro level, or the micro level influences the macro level, we have to consider the interaction between the individual and the social. Not just one process after the other, but also how these things interact. And what I proposed is to consider that this level of social interactions, we can put the focus on this interaction between the macro level and the micro level. So it was a proposition by Devine, already, to look more at social interactions, to see how individuals both are shaped by the context and how they both shaped the context in return. And if we consider this conceptual framework, we can propose that there are, of course, different methodological approaches. Of course, you can have some focus groups to look into these social interactions, and I will explain why, but I think there are also other kinds of methodological approaches like triangulation or, for example, multi-level analysis, etc. So this is just a proposition to look here at focus groups, but this is why I use focus groups, to try to understand how the collective and the individual interact. So what are focus groups? I'm going to start with the first definition. It's a research technique, so mostly when we talk about focus groups, we want to say that we conducted group discussion for a research aim, and this research technique collects data through group interaction on a topic determined by the researchers. So it's the researcher who said what we are talking about in this discussion. It's not a natural discussion. And another important point is in this definition is that data is collected through group interactions. So it makes a huge difference with collective interviews where people are talking to the moderator, In focus groups, people are talking together, participants are talking together, but not with the moderator. So from this first definition, I just want to go a little bit back in the past and explain why you will find everything about how to conduct focus groups. and contradictory advices. So let me first start. What's the history? I cannot say it's the history of focus groups because, as you will see, this authors never used the terminology of focus group. But at the very beginning, we can say, in November 1941, at the Office of Radio Research at Columbia University, Paul Lazarsfeld was conducted some study about how participants interpret and familiarize, receive some radio, some information, etc. And so what they were doing is having 12 or 20 participants sitting in rows in a room and listening to a radio program, and they had to push on a red button if they felt negative emotion, and on a green button for positive emotions. And after that, they conducted some kind of debriefing, kind of interview. And Merton said, "Okay, my feeling is that you do not write with the way you are conducting these interviews. I will show you how you should do that in order to not have biases, etc." And they published a book which was called Focused Interviews in order to explain this method. But we have to say that they never talked about focus group, and they never considered that this data, this qualitative data, are empirical evidence. It's just for them qualitative data, which could be a source for new ideas and for new hypotheses, but they think that only experimental evidence could be a good demonstration. The interesting point is that they published a book, which is out of print since 1970, and everybody, or half of the people conducting focus groups, said that Merton is the inventor of focus groups. He never talked about that, and the other half ignore the story of Merton and Lazarsfeld. But there are also other sources on how to conduct. This book was used then to do focus group. People try to apply the good receipt that they provided. But this focused interview also was very relevant for marketing research, and therefore a lot of focus groups were conducted in marketing research because you can access the consumer's perceptions, it's user-friendly, etc. So they also developed a lot of rules on how to conduct focus groups. There are also contributions from clinical psychology, where the group and interactions was used to facilitate individuals' treatment process, and group were used to emphasize deep thoughts, feelings, spontaneous expressions, etc. So you will also find a lot of literature explaining how you should conduct group discussion in this way. And you have also contribution from sociology, I already talked about that, and from social psychology, which are more related to group dynamics as they were considered by Lewin, for example, etc. But in a certain way, if you put together all the good advice given by all this literature, you will have something like a melting pot, because it does not make sense to mix together aims of marketing research with aims of clinical psychology, etc. But this is what you will find in the literature. I have to say, there are a lot of bad things published on focus groups. What I want you to make clear today is that rather than putting good rules together, you should try to make your own stew. We are in France, so I can make a little cook metaphor. When you prepare a stew, you have to reflect about which things I put together. So you should not do like my son do, when he wants to prepare a kind of soup after a walk in the forest, where he put together everything and it just smells bad. This is probably what you will do if you do not try to understand where the good advice from focus group literature can come from. So try to go beyond the one-size-fits-all model and try to prepare your own focus groups with your own receipt, which should be adapted to every study. And I'm really too long. So just want to say maybe there are a lot of other definitions and they are really pretty, maybe just this one, which you really find a lot in the literature, where the idea that focus groups are a thinking society in miniature, you know, that you can really observe how people, how participants share social meanings and reconstruct these social meanings. I think this excerpt from Halkia is also a very helpful citation. She said, focus groups data can be used both to investigate certain patterns of everyday activities across context, as well as being used to show how these patterns become situationally negotiated. So think again about how the macro level and the micro level interact. You know, people use meanings which circulate at the macro level, but at the same time, they may transform them and therefore transform the macro level. So, just because I see the time and I want to give some examples, saying another important point is that saying that the interaction in focus group produces the data is not the same as saying that interactions itself is data. So you also have to reflect about what will you do with these interactions. It's good to have interactions because people will talk together, but it's not the same when you also try to analyze this data. So just to summarize a little bit, this is a conceptual framework I have presented. We can talk about focus groups as a kind of social interactions. In this social interaction, participants rely on pre-existing social meanings and reconstruct them. And by promoting and analyzing social interaction in focus groups, the methodology offers a great opportunity to understand how social phenomena affect and are affected by the members of the group. And so I don't want to give you a rule of thumb, but rather advise you to prepare the best stew for each research. And I will try to show you with two researches how I try to prepare the best stew. I will start with a study on a new disability law we have conducted and published with Paula Castro and Valérie Haas, where we met some multidisciplinary teams who were in charge of assessing children's disabilities. These teams were composed by a doctor, by a psychologist, by a teacher, and depending on each region, some other professionals. They were working on cases based on reports sent by other professionals and never met the children normally. And their role of these teams is to discuss, is this a situation of disability? And if yes, how can we compensate that? So what kind of money, etc. When we have conducted this study, there was just a new law, and we moved from a very biomedical approach to disability to a more biopsychosocial approach. So this should normally change the role of the different professionals. And we were asked to make a study in order to understand what are the expectations regarding psychological elements. So what wants this multidisciplinary team have for information regarding the psychological dimension of the child. So this is the aim of this was the context of the study, and of course what really interested us was, okay, what do they do with this new law? How do they transform or not their practices, their professional practices? How do they evaluate the children situations? I will go very I will not explain all the deficiency approaches because they are too much, but you have to understand that the first change was done at an international level. Different approaches of disability were debated and they find a kind of consensus, okay? And then each country has to, so this was a new definition was proposed by the WHO, by the World Health Organization, and then the different countries have to adapt their own approach so that it is compatible with the WHO. So again, there were some debates at a national level, and the French proposed to have a global approach of the situation. So there is a kind of different definition from the WHO, of course. But then this new law arrived in the multidisciplinary teams who were working previously with the category-based approach, and now they have to work with a new approach of disability, and we want to understand, okay, how do they do that? So how do old and new models of disability are arranged together for making decisions about disability and compensation? We make the hypothesis that we will find cognitive polyphasia, okay? And we wanted to explore how this social representation might be associated to different group dynamics. So in order to put in, to outline that the way old and new ideas are arranged together also depends on group dynamics, and that it could be considered as relational outcomes. So just about the design of the study, we had 10 focus groups with multidisciplinary teams, so they are natural groups. We proposed a discussion agenda where we first asked the group what is a perfect teamwork, to have them talk about teamwork. Then we asked them about expectation regarding psychological elements when they have to decide about a disability situation. And then we gave them a fictional case with contradictory medical and psychological elements. This case was constructed after observation of the group's work, how they work. We saw that there are, in some cases, some contradictory elements from the medical side and from the psychological side. So we propose this kind of fictitious case to be debated by the group. I have to say the moderator was really outside the group discussion, you know, so we just asked for if there were some taken for granted who appeared, and we need an explanation for this, but mostly we do not intervene in the group dynamic here. Regarding the dimension of analysis, we had a look at on the following question: what is disability? How is it evaluated? How is it defined? What is the legitimacy granted to different experts, to the doctor, to the psychologist, to the teacher, etc.? How the different participants talk when they treat about the fictional case, how many words concretely, and how contradictory points of view are managed, you know, so how do they resolve conflict, if there is. I will not present all the results, but you can first see how we have a look at group dynamic. We have 3 types of groups appearing after the analysis, you know, 3 kind of patterns. So there are 3 groups who clearly have a medical approach of disability, still, I would say, still a medical approach of disability. Mostly the doctor, the medical, knows if there is disability or not, and some team members try to disagree in an implicit way. I agree, but, you know, the yes, but, which was also described by Paola Castro. In other groups, we call them a systemic approach. Team members rather employ shared meaning categories. They use narratives. You know, we had a previous case. It was a little bit the same situation. What did you do? What did we do? So a very different way of working together. And they ask numerous questions. So in the medical approach, the medical knowledge is central. Other types of knowledge are denied. Rather, in the systemic approach, recognition of all relevant knowledge is considered expert. I have some excerpt here. For example, how can the psychologist, how can she know that the psychological pain is due to the visual impairment? That's it. And another professional said, she's a psychologist, eye specialist, and all are losing. So, of course, they are delegitimating the psychologist point of view. Anyway, in another group, here it is clear that in the medical part, there must be accurate details at optical level. Yes, optical, psychological, well, pediatric, psychiatric, psychological, well, all elements. Yes, I agree. The difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist, that's real. A pediatric psychiatrist must diagnose the psychological pain, say if it is invasive, so you can see that how the psychologist is really not an expert of disability. And this is very different in this excerpt. Does she have good relationships? So they are looking for all possible information, elements to put together and to have a better picture of the child. I will not read all the paper. So for the medical approach, disability is clearly a medical category, and the disability is evaluated only on the basis of medical elements. And you can see it sometimes, you know, I also look for quantitative information because it makes sense, but physicians talk a lot more than the other team members in this groups. And in the systemic approach, disability is a result of a person-environment interaction. They put together different interaction from all professionals, and all professionals have similar contribution times. So it's a very different group dynamic. So just to conclude on this study, how we articulated the individual and the collective here. There are some meanings. Definition of disability circulating on a macro level. This all come in the group discussion, you know. Even the groups who still have a medical approach, they do not ignore the new definition of disability, they criticize them. So there's a specific team dynamic, and different representation of disabilities by the teams are reconstructed during the discussion, during the practices of evaluating for disability, and therefore they will have different evaluation practices who define and construct what disability is in each region, and this is how, concretely, social representations become reality, you know, because in one region you will have a disability situation, and with the same child in another region you won't have a disability situation. So it really creates different realities. What I want to outline here is really that the meanings circulating in the social-cultural context are mobilized and renegotiated by the teams in different ways depending on group dynamics. So linking different types of social groups we try to link the different types of social groups with different types of social representations, and so we came back to this proposition by Duvin. Yeah. Time for a second study. I will try to. Is it okay for you? It's not too okay. So the second study is about a case of or social representation of malnutrition in Nepal. Nepal is a country with huge differences, and we conducted a comparative study. I will come back to that later. Just to give you an overview of the situation, 27% of children are underweighted and 36% are stunted. So this malnutrition is the norm, I have to say. It's horrible, but that's a fact. It results from the interplay of different factors. I will not talk about this, but it's not just a lack of food. It's a very difficult situation to understand. And in Nepal, there are some community management of acute malnutrition programs. That is to say that when a child is born, a female health community volunteer a female from the community come to the mother and will see how the child grows up and will make some tests in order to see if there is malnutrition or not. And if there is, the mother can go to a health center where she will have some paste to give to feed the child. And only in situation where malnutrition is very severe, she will go to the hospital. So they try to really have all help provided at the community level, so to reduce the distance to the hospital for the mothers, because sometimes they have to walk for 2 hours before finding a hospital. But there's still a gap in coverage, so the question Action Against Hunger asked me is trying to understand why do caregivers, mostly mothers, do not provide the care the child needs in case of malnutrition. And we see in the literature, I have to say there's only a few studies published about malnutrition. It's very interesting to see. It's one of the first Sustainable Development Goals, malnutrition, reducing hunger in the world. Climate change reducing is after that, but there are so much studies on climate change, but this is not the point. So malnutrition in the literature is associated to shame and guilt on the mother side, so worldwide. There are different explanations about malnutrition. Sometimes it's a bad fate, sometimes it's a kind of magic, sometimes it's because the family is poor, etc. But worldwide, there is shame and guilt for this situation. So what we have done in Nepal is research based on triangulation. And this is how we used focus groups. So it's a comparative study. We have 2 districts, Nuwakot and Saptari. We have some focus groups with caregivers of malnourished children, but we also have media discourse analysis, community members, a survey with community members, and the point of view of the health system with episodic interviews conducted with health staff, but also with traditional healers. Let me just say something about the focus group. So first about the discussion agenda. So we have 5 focus groups with 6 to 8 caregivers of children suffering malnutrition. And the first challenge was a tongue challenge. It was not possible to find native moderators because in Saptari, it was not possible. We can explain why, but it was not possible. So we have to conduct by ourselves a discussion with a translator. So I have someone translating the focus group with me. A second challenge was that caregivers' voice is mainly unconsidered by the health staff, and caregivers know this. So we have to design the focus group in a way that allows them to feel expert in their field, expert of their own children, and thus we turned to the idea that the moderator might be a stranger who must be taught. And I will explain how I did that. We developed a focus group agenda based on a funnel approach. And we first asked them how women's life in Nepal changed when becoming a mother, so they can talk about this. It's a kind of cultural knowledge, and they have this. So the moderator is the one who should be taught about their way of life and their culture. And second part, we ask them to explain which symptoms make them worry about their child's health. So the moderator draws on a big picture representing a child, a body of a child, the different symptoms evoked, so that participants could see that the moderator understands what they are saying, that it's really translated, and could also see that I cannot draw, so that I'm not good. It also was a kind of joking with them. And the main result here is that they have, of course, a lot of knowledge, you know. And little by little, we turn to malnutrition issues. So first, they were invited to comment pictures of children which may look undernourished, and later, we asked them about their own child and their story. And last but not least, we asked them to discuss together a dilemma where a young mother was told by some family members to seek for a traditional healer and by others to seek for medical support. And at this point of the discussion, it becomes evident that they felt free to share their point of view. So the analysis we conducted, the aim was to understand how they give meaning to the child's situation. And we developed a method of analysis based on thematic encoding and applied to focus group data. And we chose this method as it is well suited for comparative studies. Remember, we have focus group in Nouakchott and in Saptari. And this allows us to compare the two districts in which the study was conducted. So here are the main steps of the methods, but maybe it's more relevant to talk a little bit about some results. I will just give you the main results of focus groups in Nouakchott and nothing about Saptari. So the data analysis provide us with the way social meaning is produced by the group. Here we have some, so caregivers described malnutrition as resulting from a bad karma and as a vicious circle of disease causing what seems to be to them as long-term developmental consequences. So they explain that because the child is malnourished, he has a weak immunity, so the child has every disease, so the child cannot eat because he is ill, you know, and so he is malnourished again, and so on and so forth. And this have long-term consequences. A mother told to me, for example, that her daughter will not have a brain because she is malnourished, so, you know, so. And this, of course, conducted them to feel helplessness, all the mothers. So maybe you will say what is different here from individual interviews, where is the group? And you agree, and I agree. Why is the group dynamic not only a way to produce data, but also data as itself? The analyses show that the group supports this interpretation. So it informs us that community members and peers do not provide useful health advice for the child or for the caregiver, but maintain this perceived helplessness, you know. They do not give good advice. You should try this, it works for me, but they just feel helplessness in this situation. And, yeah, this excerpt, it's always a bit good to have some data. Bad happens with bad luck people. We need to go through all bad situations if it's written. Our child is like this. If we eat and even we feed, they're talking about some neighbors, they don't feed still their children are like this. What, like this, and she said, big child, you know. What to do? I get shocked when I watch to other. It's similar. We keep on feeding in our home, and other child is like this, even there is no one to care. They can fight, even they don't get oil massage and never get ill. And mine is like this, even I carry every time and care. It's like that. Everything is about karma. So I have to say that if we put this perceived helplessness and this interpretation as a bad karma in the context again, by using triangulation, there's a context with a huge stigmatization of malnutrition in the press, but also in the discourse of the health staff. So in this sense, when caregivers said it's a bad karma, the situation of malnutrition, it's because they are in a context where the health staff and community members from the survey and the media analysis show that malnutrition is interpreted by others as a lack of care by the mothers. In Saptari, they said people are not educated, so they do not know how to care the child. But in Nouakchott, they said there is a lack of care, and here we are modern, we know how to educate our children, so they are just bad mothers. And in this context, of course, caregivers, they try to make the best to take care of the children, but it does not work, so they can just say it's a bad karma, you know, and this reinforces perceived helplessness. So, yeah, I want to have time for discussion, so I think it's... We have time this morning? Okay, so maybe just to conclude and make some recommendations about how to use focus groups. So, of course, you should propose a discussion agenda in order to maximize interactions between participants. Indeed, participants should discuss together and not discuss with the moderator. And we know from social psychological literature that group cohesiveness improves social interaction. So you have to propose tasks, etc., which might improve this cohesiveness. What does it mean, cohesiveness? It is the extent to which members of a group are attracted to each other, accept and agrees with the priorities and goals of the group, and contribute to help achieving the goals. So give them some goals. You can do that by improving task cohesion, which refers to the degree to which there is a shared commitment among group members to achieve a particular outcome or goal. So, for example, we ask them to draw, we ask them to discuss a fictitious case, etc. We also have to try to improve social cohesion, so the degree to which group members are attracted to and identify with one another and with the group. This is, of course, a point which I have not addressed in this communication, in this presentation, but this means that there are some important sampling issues which people can I bring together to discuss. So maybe we can have some question about this. Who is in the same group, who not, and what can you do when you have to use natural groups? This is also, yeah. But of course, these are some rule of thumb, and you need to compose with reality. And as I have tried to show you in Nepal, I decided first to have participants talking to the researcher so that they feel that they have some important knowledge and that they are confident and can talk in a confident way. And little by little, the discussion agenda sustained a group discussion where the moderator was a bit more outside. So preparing the discussion agenda is always a very complex issue, and you should negotiate between what should theoretically work and what is the reality constraint, and so you have to prepare the best stew you can do. You have to carefully plan the role of the moderator, what is the role, and and you have to develop a method of analysis that enables you to articulate the content and the dynamic of the discussion. Yeah, I think that's it. So they are the main references.
So we will have time for some questions. We can make this work.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very clear, and also the case study is very interesting. And I've been dealing and exercising with focus groups for a bit now because it was my first thesis. So I've been reviewing the literature for a long time. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about the sampling procedures. First, because I think just as a matter of time and resources that we have as PhD students, there are a lot of compromises that we have to make. And I was wondering if at a certain stage you are actually able to get the participants you want, to match the sampling procedure you are picturing. And then the related question is, do you actually find that the cohesive groups are the most rich in data?
Which group?
When the group is cohesive, like a coherent social group.
You mean before the discussion or during? Natural group.
Yeah, either natural, but also like you sample the group based on a variable. So
okay.
say
Yeah.
All young women.
Yeah, all young women.
I know.
Do
what
you find that content and that dynamic is actually richer in your experience, or is it richer, for instance, if you mix young and old women? Because I've been finding contradictory, for me it's been depending even, just, I don't know if it's luck or not.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. These are all very important questions, so I'm happy that I have them now. Recruitment for focus group studies is a high issue, of course. And for my PhD study, for example, I had a population which was more easier to find than caregivers of malnourished groups or multidisciplinary teams, etc. You know, you have also to reflect about this when you design your focus group, and this is a reality constraint, I guess. For example, mostly I do not do research with psychology students, you know. But in one study, we were interested in the emotional and representational processes when a group face collective guilt, and why not using psychology students, their group, like a novel, for example. So it really, you should try to do the best, but of course it's far more complicated to organize focus group discussions than individual interviews. It takes more time, and mostly I try to have more people invited than I really need for the discussion. This is also what I did in Nepal, so I said to them, okay, we need 8 participants at least, or something like 8 or 9 participants at least. So as they, in Nepal, when they organized the focus groups, they said, okay, 8 to 9, maybe we will have 10 to 12, because we want to be sure that we have 11 to 9, so I would, at the end we have sometimes too many people. So you should also discuss this stuff with your collaborators, if you have. Regarding the participants you want, it's not always possible. For example, this is also a reality constraint. In Nepal, we wanted to have a group of caregivers who went through the whole treatment, and participants who stopped the treatment. It was not possible to find caregivers who stopped the treatment, not because they do not want to come, but because when the staff called the participants and said, we are going to make a study, your child was in a program, so you stopped the program, would you be part of the discussion? They said, oh, my child is so bad, could you do something for him? And then they started the program again, you know. So, of course, you have to adapt to the reality. Regarding which participants you can put together, you have to have some homogeneity in the groups, of course, to have more cohesiveness, but not homogeneity regarding the object of discussion, you know. You should have in your group people from who you know, who you can suspect that they will have some points of disagreement, and we'll talk about that. So not taking people who are too close together, of course it's important, but mostly there still is some points which will make debate, you know. Sometimes it's not. I'm thinking about some dilemmas which were proposed by Markova, and I do not remember the collaborators, regarding the medical secret, regarding HIV. And in some groups in France, there was no debate because it's not a point which should be discussed. The medical secret must be respected. So you cannot put together people who are too different, but you still have to have different people in the, we had a little bit this kind of discussion yesterday with a study about gender inequalities, Of course, this is not focus groups because the groups are very important, but if you want to discuss gender issues, maybe it depends what you want to look for in the group discussion. Do you want to look for the way men and women discuss about this issue and which kind of debate emerge when they discuss together? Do you want to observe how women cope with that? So maybe you will prefer just women groups, etc. So come back to the research question. I would say that.
Main question is how can you measure is not the best.
Can you talk just a little bit louder?
Yeah, how can you measure the discussion? Or how can you, what are you doing when you are thinking about that? You try to investigate in the discussion.
You mean what kind of analysis?
Yes.
We have developed, during my PhD, we have developed the thematic encoding, which was proposed by Uwe Flick for comparative researches, for example. We have proposed some adaptation for focus group studies so that we have the themes always have a kind of dynamic. What theme comes before another, and also the group dynamic. Is there some consent, some debate, etc. So of course it's mostly a very qualitative analysis. You can do it alone, or you can use some Max QDRs or Atlas T, NVivo, etc. if you want to keep it all on the laptop, for example. So it might make things a bit easier. But at the end, it's a very qualitative analysis. The book and the methods developed also by Markova for dialogical approach of focus groups and dialogical analysis is also very helpful. And of course, I think, but that's always the case when you do qualitative analysis, you also have to find some tools from different types of approaches like conversation analysis, critical discourse analysis. So just look, how do they do? It's not about doing conversational analysis, but they help you to find and to be vigilant for certain kinds of indicators in the text. For example, when I had a physician in multidisciplinary teams saying, I think that, blah, 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 blah. So we decide, blah, 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 blah. Okay? This is the kind of, you cannot catch that with measures. You have to, yeah.
Sorry, can I just add one sentence? Thinking more broadly about it's important what Sabine is saying. Everything is important what Sabine has said today, but this point is important. Don't imagine that you will see the interaction emerging by itself. You need to know, to have a theoretical, methodological background to detect different index of interaction.
Yeah, and sometimes, because at the end you present all the things in the paper and you have some beautiful hypothesis and a way to operationalize that, etc. But you never do the analysis in that way. You know, for the multidisciplinary teams, for example, I was preparing a presentation for a congress which is a bit positivist, I have to say. So I was asking myself, how can I show that the physicians are taking such a central role? And then I think, okay, just count the number of words. But I didn't do that to find the patterns, you know. It was more like a feeling, more qualitative indicators, and then you say, okay, but you can formalize that also.
Okay, thank you, Sabine, for your very interesting and very clear presentation. I have just one question referring to your third recommendation. I want to ask you if you have some example of how do group dynamics shape the construction of meaning during focus group discussion, like opinion, polarization, or influence of a leadership of a leader. I don't know if I'm...
Yes, we have published that, I would say, in 2030 with Nikos in the paper about my PhD, the focus groups which I have conducted and which I took as an illustration to start with, where we can see, I do not remember exactly the results, but how French and German react to the minority position. Because in each focus group we have conducted, of course, there were at least one people who has more extreme position regarding ecology. And so we try to see how the group reacts to this minority point of view, you know?
Other questions?
Thank you. My question is about the non-verbal body language aspects of these group dynamics, because sometimes, you know, you enter a room. I've only been a participant in focus groups. I've never conducted, but even that's very interesting because you enter the space and then you think, where do I sit? You look at the people and you try to sit next to someone you feel a bit familiar with. I don't know. I think it's a lot of information is also who you keep looking at when you're talking or seeking confirmation from. How do you grasp those aspects of these dynamics which are not spoken but they're present in the group?
I never conducted systematic analysis of non-verbal behaviors, but of course there are some. They can also help you to construct some hypotheses, and which will help you then to analyze the data. But you are right, sometimes people do things or look at things and it makes really sense. I remember, for example, with students, I had a seminar where we analyzed focus group data together, and they come with a video of the. And in one group, for example, we were discussing about, I do not remember exactly, but the ecological crisis or relationship to nature, etc. And you have a woman arriving a little bit later than the other groups. The discussion has already started, and she came into the room and she has a tote bag, you know, with written, "Do not eat animals" or something like this. And okay, everybody knows before she just enters the room, and everybody knows who is entering the believe to know who is entering the room and which opinion she has. In other focus groups, so for example, where we look for how the group cope with collective guilt, we asked the group to make a task from which we believe that we would feel guilty after that. And it was answering a questionnaire, you know, and the one who has the questionnaire at the end of the discussion said, okay, we need 3 planets if everybody would live like this. Okay, next question. And of course, you know, but there are also some traces in the discourse itself that helps to capture that. So I never had the situation where I only have, or where my feeling was that I missed something because I do not analyze. We really have to consider that people doing, colleagues doing conversational analysis, for example, analyze very, very little exchanges, natural exchanges, but very little interaction. So when you have 1 hour and a half discussion and 10 groups, you cannot look for everything. You have to choose. And it's frustrating.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. And my question relates to the one of Sylvester. I was wondering if you ever worked with, not for photo elicitation of participants, but with drawing. So asking participants to draw as a starting point also of discussions, and how, what are the challenges, if you have some suggestions about this?
Yes, this is exactly what we asked in another study I was presented in Brest. We do not ask them to draw, we ask them to represent on a way or another. We say, do what you want with all the stuff which is here in the material. What are the challenges? Of course, some people don't know how to draw, but it was interesting to see also what works. So by asking them to construct this together, indeed, they construct this together. Some groups tries to make a little drawing first, each of them, and then, okay, what did you do? Okay, what should we then? Others started the discussion, and but at the end, still 1 or 2 person propose, and the others complete just by saying, we should also represent this, and maybe we can grow this. It was really interesting to see also how the drawing supports data analysis, because in a certain way you have the main track of the discussion and of the debate, which is already fixed on the drawing, on the representation, and this was also very helpful for the data analysis. Yeah.
Did you also analyze the drawings or only the discussions? So was it like this multimodal analysis or only?
I would say both of them. But both of them together, but it was one and the same task. Doing the drawing and discussing it, you know. So, yeah, it goes hand in hand, so you cannot analyze one without the other. But it was really, I had these big drawings, and I had the feeling that there were different kinds of groups, and so I could really have the drawings on the wall and try to put them in another way and try to find which are the patterns and go back to the discussion and saying, okay, here we are a group who never talk about solutions of climate change. And it's not in the drawing, and on all the other drawing it is. So, you know, yeah.
I wanted actually to ask about photo elicitation because I work with images, and I was thinking that integrating the method would be a good idea. But in my case, working with atrocity and war photography, maybe the risk would be to unmediate a message and compromise the discussion.
what are you what are you working about? Atrocities?
Atrocity photograph, war photographs.
Okay.
So maybe putting up an image that cruel, that brutal, risks to compromise the conversation and let me know what we think about that.
I'm looking at Mao because I'm thinking about
Because of the atrocity.
No, no, because of the paper with Sonia. Do I remember?
What? I don't know. It's Sonia.
Maybe I'm wrong, but didn't you write a paper about photo elicitation and
Photo voice?
Photo voice, yeah. Yeah, it was about photo voice. So it's a bit different. I agree. Yeah.
But I also.
But maybe you can add something to my answer if you want. But I would first say, okay, but maybe people are seeing these pictures in other spaces of their life, you know, in other kind of situations. Probably they are not really new for them. So, okay. But then you also have to discuss, I think it's more an ethical issue. What can I show and what can I not show? So, but because the group.
Also this photo langage technique, no? That you use different pictures that they categorize or they talk about how to categorize, you know, which are some of the shoes, and then we are talking about.
I would say it's better to do that in a group situation than in an individual interview. Because when people feel some emotions, what they want to do is social sharing of emotions. So they already have the possibility to do that.
I may add precisely in the work with Sonia. Okay, that was about energy transition. But in my opinion, any image could have the potentiality to stop the discussion. Because, you know, one of the strengths of the image is that it is assumed to be real, the lay and extending of images. So it seems self-evident. So even this kind of images, the point is how to create the dynamic. In our study with Sonia Blondi, we had some image about energy transition that came from a previous study. So we asked them first to categorize a number of images from the most representative to the least representative, and then to discuss in group. At the very beginning, it seemed that there was no discussion. So the group was consensual, and that's it. Something that, if I understood you fear, no, I can give this. But then we asked to try to rearrange the images according to a different vision. We kind of prompted the dynamic. Then it came out that from a different angle they were able to provide a totally different interpretation. Like, I don't know, I don't remember precisely, kind of an electric car, which was, yes, this transition that we can know, absolutely. Because I know that our interest was not about the content, really, but how they were able to change perspective and how they manage the inconsistency, for example, of their role.
Yeah, for me the question is more an ethical issue.
Question?
Just to make another one. I wanted an advice. I think that it's very important what you were suggesting about making the group explain to you, position yourself not as the expert moderator, but since, for instance, I'm studying the energy transition, and inevitably, even just because I'm a PhD student, every participant feels like I'm the expert. And like in your data, they were saying Sabine is not telling us. And I was wondering, how do you manage that? Because it's
non-verbal behavior, you know. I'm interested in your opinion, and you go just to go back. In some focus groups, the one about collective guilt, we were really interested in how the group cope with these negative emotions. I was even sitting outside the table, so 2 meters away from the group, just to let them know that what really interests me is how they discuss together. You know? And this is an important thing you have to say at the very beginning of the discussion. I'm interested in your point of view and how you debate, discuss it together. So, yeah. And I took the example of the Nepalese study because, of course, I proposed a discussion agenda where I knew that it is not the way we should conduct focus groups. You know, you should not ask participants to talk to you in focus groups. But it was for me, it was the only way to have them becoming confident and then talking together. The book by Rosaline Barbour, which was published in 2008, is really, really helpful on the role of the moderator, for example, doing focus groups. Barbour, B-A-R-B-O-U-R.
My question is kind of building on Mirella's. Don't you think an observer's position is quite a powerful position as well? To even say that I'm sitting out and looking at you while you talk, and I think to be observed can make people.
It certainly reinforces the guilt feelings.
Yeah.
Certainly, it's not neutral. Absolutely not. But I was there. I was sitting there, and you know, sometimes I also asked for some questions. But it just okay. I was sitting close to the camera and created a space where, okay, it might be possible that she's sitting there just to look for technique, for example. It's easier for her, but we know she is here, okay? But of course, you're always in the room. But it just, you know, sometimes when you're doing individual interviews, rather than asking for another question, some advice is to wrote something. I mean, we have all the material to listen after that. So we do not need to take notes, but taking notes is a way to let the other understand that what he is saying is relevant. So you can play a little bit with these kind of things.
America, sometimes they also do focus groups with no
Yeah.
moderator inside the room. Yeah, and it's also the double mirror.
Question is then, what's the motivation of the participants?
Can I also add a different experience on the power, no? But just for them to understand what you say, no? Because there is no perfect single. A different context was in Bangladesh, which the participants of the action research were called beneficiaries. So they were formally beneficiaries of the intervention. There was no way out of this. It would have made no sense for them if we were not, Westerner, white, etc. We were not in a position of power. So we were actually required to stay there and to conduct the group from the table, no? And the beneficiaries in front of us. Disrupting this dynamic would have stopped everything, no? Because it would have been, let's say, too strange in that context. What can you do? It's not the perfect situation for me. It's the best that I can achieve, and then you have to play with what you have.
Good morning, thank you so much for your presentation, Professor. I find it very interesting and it resonates a lot, both with like the work right now, but also for like the focus groups that I want to build later on. And I think like when it comes to positioning and also to relationship, also taking that into account, like sharing the fact that, like making it explicit that you are actually trying to give space to the other person, to the individual you are interviewing, is kind of, it's not a way to be neutral, but it's also a way to put that on the table, like saying, I know that we have this kind of relationship, but I'll try my best to make sure that your space to express your opinion is there. And also, like later on, that's actually the question I wanted to ask, like making that explicit once more, maybe at the end of that explicit, once more, also at the end of the interview, like trying to understand how you are seen by the interviewee. That could also be kind of interesting. But I wanted to ask you, like, actually, have you ever like done any research, or do you have any kind of bibliography references you'd like to suggest when it comes to the position of the researcher into focus groups, the relationship and power structure that comes up?
Okay, so about the idea to asking participants at the end of the discussion how they see you, I think it's not. It's not the aim of the study I have conducted. It could be, and maybe we would have some complementary, in maybe also some contradictory elements with what we can see and analyze from the data. You know, as I took the first example, Sabine is mocking us. Okay, when they say something like this, they clearly considered me as an expert of climate change. So you can, by analyzing the discussion or the interviews, for example, and the interaction during it, you can see how they perceive you, which role they want you to play at a certain moment, and also, and this is more important, how this changed during the discussion or during the interview. Because I'm convinced, I have to say, I would like to say I'm not sure, but I'm convinced that you do not play the same role during all the discussion or during all the interview, etc. And no, I didn't find any literature on the question of positionality in focus groups by the moderator, and I felt a bit surprised that it does not exist in literature, but I think we should have to think about that, because certainly there are some similarities with individual interviews, but there are also some specificities. Yeah.
So maybe we thank you, Sabine.